From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. In Oregon, we're about midway through the commercial crop pollination season. Blueberries are done, meadow foam is waning, we're starting to see the clovers come on. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to catch up with Adam Allington, who's a reporter with Bloomberg Environment. He covers environmental issues, including pesticides and chemicals, for Bloomberg. And recently, he joined Tiffany Stecker in launching a podcast series for Bloomberg called The Business of Bees, where they go through and they look at all of the dimensions of how bees are plugged into the economy and some of the limits that that economy may face. Longtime listeners will remember back on episode 5, we had Mike Burgett talk about pollination markets here in the Pacific Northwest. So this is a really great show to dive a little deeper into the business of bees. Adam, welcome to Pollination.
Happy to be here.
I listened to the first episode of The Big Business of Bees, and we were really pleased because Mark Johnson, one of Oregon beekeepers, was on the episode. And I have to say right at the beginning, Bloomberg and bees are not two words that people necessarily put together. So can you just begin by telling us what prompted you to investigate the changing face of the business of bees?
Yeah, well, I think you're probably right. That this is this isn't your standard, stock market coverage that Bloomberg is known for. However, I work on a team called Bloomberg Environment, where we do cover environmental policy questions, specifically from Washington, D.C., and bees was one of those topics that kind of, had a toe in all these different areas in environmental policy, as I mentioned, business, science and research. And so as I've been reporting about pesticides, over time, I keep coming back to stories about bees. And so that's why we initially sort of pitched this idea for an in-depth series about bees.
And I guess the story, at least from the perspective of the podcast, starts in California. So you and your co-host headed out to the largest pollination event on the planet, the almond pollination event. What was that like? What surprised you about, what did you expect to find, and what did you find?
Well, I actually grew up on a cherry farm myself from a region of the country known for cherries. So I've actually seen these large orchard blossom events before. But even that really didn't compare to the Central Valley during almond bloom. Just these massive tracts of orchard crops all blooming at the same time. You just really, it really jumps out, to put an obvious point out there, that these orchards are there. And then when you walk into the orchards themselves and you just hear this buzz just kind of rising up out of the earth, because there's 2 full hives per acre. And, that's a lot of beehives, especially if you're talking about 800, 1,000 acres. And so just seeing that many trees and that many bees all sort of up and running together, it's really just a beautiful experience to see. And I thought that was, as your listeners probably know, almond pollination is really the tail that wags the pollination dog. So that's as you say, that's why we decided to start this series there.
Yeah, and it is. We had Professor Lena Nino on a past episode. We just got an update from this year's almond pollination event, and it is really remarkable to just the coordination. You have a bunch of businesses all together, arranging the shipment of these bees, putting them in place. It's a huge production in terms of just logistics, people being able to get things delivered on time. It's quite remarkable.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it's one might ask, why don't when people find out, for instance, that commercial beekeepers bring bees from as far away as Michigan or Florida or Maine or Texas and so forth, common response is sort of like, well, why don't they just grow the bees out there in California? Then they don't have to truck them in from so far. But California is a state where there are two big things. There's a lot of agricultural development and a lot of human development. And finding space with sufficient floral resources to raise bees in the off season, and then also to get them sort of out of the chemical agricultural window after they're done pollinating these crops is a trick. So that's why, for instance, you see so many beekeepers coming from Montana, North Dakota, places like that, where they still do have a little bit of space to raise this many hives. And that was really one of the surprising things to me personally, is that in this big country, we're almost running out of space to raise bees.
That is pretty remarkable, and it is a kind of strange way of thinking about it. You need all this land mass to support 2.5 million bee colonies, and they all, at least for such an early season crop that's experienced such tremendous growth over the last few decades, it almost takes all of this land mass to support this the growth of these bee colonies for this pollination.
Right, and it should be said, we're talking specifically about commercial honeybees, Apis mellifera, compared to, say, wild and native bees that live in these environments all year. And so, some of your listeners who are gardeners, for instance, may be able to create habitat even within cities and so forth by planting more forage for bees. But if you're out in the agricultural landscape and it's all corn and soybeans, there's not a lot of place for wild bees or honeybees to sustain themselves. So that's why, as you say, you really got to get out there to find enough place to keep these bees. Because, for instance, there's abundant food resources for these bees during almond bloom, during apple bloom, during cherry bloom, and so forth. But then when all of those blooming events are done, they still need to eat.
Right, of course. Well, maybe take us through the episode. So in this first episode, you sort of set up these issues. These are kind of the new and emerging. This is not the beekeeping of 40 years ago where the primary source of income was honey. This is a much different model. And I have not heard the second episode, but it almost sounds like you're coming back to visiting this species, the honeybee. Tell us a little bit about the second episode and the arc of the episodes coming forward.
Sure. Our two primary storytelling buckets for this series are the kind of business of pollination, the business of the pollination economy, and then also the science and environmental policy questions surrounding bees. Those are the two big areas that we focus on. And within that, we've broken it down into 6 episodes. The first one we just called the big business of bees to kind of set up this booming economy. The second episode is all about the honeybee itself, Apis mellifera, sort of a deep dive on how Apis mellifera became, the bee of choice for not only for beekeepers but just humans in general. Mm-hmm. And then the third episode is all about just bees and agriculture. So in that episode, we do go to California, we go to Michigan, and then the fourth episode is about bees as a symbol. Are they a good symbol for these environmental issues? Do we need to save the bees, as some groups say? And do we need to save honeybees, or are honeybees the bees we should be putting our attention on, or should we be focusing more on wild and native bees like your bumblebees and so forth? And the fifth episode is all about varroa mites, bee pests, and the last episode we dive straight into the science of pesticides and try to really get at what role pesticides are playing in these pollinator die-offs.
That really covers the span of most of the major issues, and I really love this upcoming episode and sort of setting it up how we came into the system, because I do remember, when I first got into this in the 1990s, it was really hard to convince some growers to actually stock with bee colonies. There was a huge period in the beginning after World War II, where there was a lot of work put into really showing the benefits of pollination to growers. But it seems like we've sort of turned that corner now, and the demand for hives is there. And we've reflecting on sort of that second to last episode, we're facing challenges in being able to provide the supply.
Right. Well, I mean, you can kind of connect the dots, from California, and as you say, this post-World War II environment, and the interstate highways are going in, and all of a sudden it's very convenient and rather easy to move hives around. And as you know, they grow basically everything in California, from almonds and oranges and strawberries to fruit, all kinds of fruits and vegetables, and they grow them kind of in close proximity to each other. So that's when this pollination experiment kind of gathered steam. But really, almonds again drove this to the point where the expansion of almond acreage every year created so many more hives. And when they were done with almonds, those bees needed a job, and so they looked around and found other crops for them to go to. And pollination, in a sense, became the sort of enhancer for agriculture. You found crops that traditionally didn't use commercial pollination now found out they could get a bit of a boost, or a slightly better quality of fruit by using honeybees to pollinate. And so a lot of crops that didn't use commercial bees in years past are now doing it. And now that this whole thing is up and running, we're kind of locked into commercial bee pollination in ways we never really were before.
That's fascinating, having what in this sort of centrality of this one large crop. And my understanding is that for a beekeeper that goes to almonds, they can pay off their expenses for the year from one pollination. So in some ways, this kind of creates that supply that, as you point out, then bee colonies looking for another income source. Hey, have you thought about using honeybees? And that can open up further pollination.
Yeah, it's quite lucrative, but I should also point out, the barriers to entry are quite steep. I've asked people this question: if this is such a gangbusters economy, why isn't everyone getting into beekeeping, or why don't the people who are doing this right now, why don't they double the number of hives they have? Honeybees are in a sense livestock, so just make more livestock. But the costs embedded in keeping your hive numbers up now are so high. And when you factor in semis trucking the bees around, those are really steep costs. And so there's the cost, and there's also the technology and the know-how that's necessary to really keep bees alive today is quite high. So you're really looking at an economy where a relatively, few number of providers are charged with meeting this increased supply. So it's not as simple as just, doubling the amount of hives you have or getting into the business quickly. And so that's where we get at this kind of tension where we're kind of using all the commercial hives we have. There's not a lot of space for, say, another, if these die-offs continue or if they get worse, we might not have enough hives to meet the demand of these farmers.
And if I remember, there was when you were speaking to one of the beekeepers, you posed that very question in the first episode of, what if, could you increase the numbers? Is there, how high does the price have to go? And his response was pretty clear that, he's up against some real limits in terms of being able to sustain those losses.
Right. And as even at, say, $200 a hive, which is a very good price historically, there's only so many costs you can pass on to your customers. You can't say, based on the economics of where a lot of these commodity crops are at, or these specialty crops, they couldn't sustain, the market couldn't sustain, say, $300 a hive. So beekeepers are really doing everything they can, pushing every button they can to try to keep the hives they have alive, whether that's splitting and splitting and splitting hives again and again, to investing in new ways to help the bees overwinter safely, to provide supplemental food and forage. And, the amount of research and R&D that has gone into the modern beekeeping operation is quite impressive. So, those are all those are costs that are going on. That's a learning curve that's quite steep. And so it's becoming, like much of agriculture, it's becoming this very sophisticated technical operation.
Well, let's take a quick break. I want to come back and just get some other reflections on the series now looking back after it's been produced. Okay, we are back, and I want to just back up a little bit and tell us a little bit about why this focus on the business of bees. What did you think was really lacking without having that dimension sort of of the story brought forward?
I think the thing that really stood out for me was just how integrated bees and pollinators have become into these modern, industrial agriculture systems. The fact that these fields are now road to road, basically without any floral barriers around them whatsoever. The fact that farmers mainly don't use cover crops anymore. They use synthetic fertilizers. The way that pollination windows are now so tight, and farmers basically just don't want to risk getting a bad pollination. So bees have become just another input in the same way that water, fertilizer, pesticides, labor are. And, it has provided increased yields, it's provided increased quality, and it's basically this insurance policy that a lot of farmers want to have now, that they want those honeybees out in their fields, and they're used to it now, and it's just become kind of embedded in industrial agriculture in a way that commercial pollination never has before.
Oh, that's good. So I guess without this dimension, if you didn't understand how these things are structured, how this paradigm shift sort of has embedded itself, it would be very difficult to understand. If an alien came to the U.S. and looked at all these bees being trucked around, and be like, I don't quite understand what's going on here. That there is a kind of by having a business perspective, you can understand how this paradigm has evolved over time.
Yeah, it makes sense when you connect the dots, but it's also worth pointing out that the United States is kind of an outlier here. We're really one of the few countries that goes to this extreme with their pollination services. Most countries are not trucking their bees hundreds or thousands of miles around. And so in that respect, it's worth noting that there are people who say that we need not be as wedded to commercial pollination as we are. That, for instance, this 1/3 of all bites of food we take are dependent on bees for pollination. That there are people who doubt that statistic, or I should say, who say, it's not like a lot of these crops would vanish from store shelves were we to stop using honeybees for pollination.
Huh. The first thing I think is worth remarking is, so in other if you were to go to Southeast Asia or the Middle East or the EU, you don't have this level of a colony mobility where they're in Michigan one day and Florida another. This is quite unique in the world.
Oh yeah, it is very unique. And, you mentioned, Asia, and China famously has, in some cases used humans to pollinate apples to greater effect than bees. And so there are ways that we could potentially keep these crops in production. And there's also a significant amount of research, as your listeners probably know, into alternative pollinators, your blue orchard bees, your horn-faced bees, other native species that could potentially be adapted to a managed pollinator environment.
Yeah, and the second point I want to keep expanding on it, so that if we became a little bit less reliant on honeybees and there is a way in which certain crops might suffer, but not everything. And there may be these alternate pollinator systems, which would then become affordable or become more visible. Say more about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the research being done right now is showing promise in, maybe not to the degree where we feel comfortable, say, completely replacing honeybees, but, for instance, horn-faced bees can be used in conjunction with honeybees to great effect. And a lot of these native species are actually better pollinators, on a pound-for-pound basis. Say 500 blue orchard bees can do the work of, almost one hive. So the trick becomes deploying them in the sort of quantities you need to really be sure you'll get a sufficient pollination. So the issue right now is augmenting honeybees with native species as kind of an extra amount of insurance. And who's to say that maybe at some point some crops could be completely reliant on these managed native bees as well.
Well, I guess that's one of the last questions I have for you is, are you seeing emerging opportunities? So when you went around the country and produced the episode, the series, did you see kind of glimpses of the future of how things could be better?
Well, I think there is a lot of promising research happening right now for ways to to mitigate against varroa mites or other bee pests. I feel like that's a problem that can be solved. It is wrapped up in with the way we use bees. So obviously, putting 80% of your commercial hives in one spot every year is not necessarily a good way to protect yourself against the spread of disease. But if we can get a handle on the die-off rates to get them back down, I think you could really see commercial beekeeping become a true growth market in terms of actual numbers of hives that, pushing beyond 2.3 million, 2.5 million, heading on up over 3. I think another opportunity is still the fact that honey is still a thing. People still eat honey and the numbers are going up. So the trick becomes finding a way to market your honey in a way that taps, that makes sense at your scale. And so I've spoken with people who are selling honey and who are making mead and who are, using those local food systems as a way to earn revenue. And those show great promise as well. In many ways, mead's kind of like alcoholic cider was, like 10 years ago or something.
Oh yeah, totally.
It's
right on the cutting edge.
It's big business now. So, I think those are markets that are going to continue to grow. And if the commercial pollination business stays where it's at, and we can get a handle on some of these policy issues related to bee die-off, then I think we're going to be looking at a good system. Honeybees they're amazing creatures. They're wild, but they're also domestic. The way the hive structure works, it's just fascinating. And one thing you hear a lot when you talk to bee people is that, honeybees, while different than native bees, are still, what benefits honeybees does in large part benefit native bees as well. And the problems faced by commercial beekeepers are a problem. This is an issue. Like, we want commercial beekeepers to be successful. And so, if we can find ways to help the rusty patch bumblebee and honeybees, then we're on the right track.
That's fantastic. I guess the last quick question I have for you as the person who sort of covers the pesticide beat. I know just this week there was this announcement of taking there were some registered neonicotinoids that are going to be brought off the market. What do you know about that story? So this announcement was actually part of a legal settlement between a coalition of environmental groups that had sued EPA back in 2017, alleging that these neonics were running afoul of the Endangered Species Act. And as part of their settlement that was reached late in 2018, EPA, or the companies, I should say, agreed to petition EPA to remove 12 neonic products from the market, 7 of which are seed coatings, and the rest are sort of commercial gardening products. And that's very significant because that actually
That's the first time these neonics have been removed from the market, and it now puts the focus on the rest of the products that are still out there. These active ingredients are all going to be up for re-registration through EPA or over the next 2-3 years. And it's going to be a live and fierce debate, I can tell you that, because farmers really want to keep these seed coating products. They rely on them quite heavily, and if they go away, or if we have restrictions, say similar to what they have in the EU, where you can only use a few neonics in greenhouses and so forth, it's going to really change the dynamic out in our fields. And so expect that to be a growing debate going forward for the neonic insecticides.
Okay, well, stay tuned. Well, The Business of Bees, it's you can get it on iTunes, Stitcher, or any of those sources. We'll have a link to it on the show notes. And I guess episode 3 airs, by the time we're going to be releasing this, episode 4 will be coming out. So stay tuned.
Thank you so much for talking to me. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening. Show notes with information discussed in each episode can be found at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. We'd also love to hear from you, and there are several ways to connect. For one, you can visit our website to post an episode-specific comment, suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at pollinationpodcast@oregonstate.edu. Finally, you can tweet questions or comments or join our Facebook or Instagram communities. Just look us up at OSU Pollinator Health. If you like the show, consider letting iTunes know by leaving us a review or rating. It makes us more visible, which helps others discover pollination. See you next week.